Welcome back to our discussion of the 1960s. This is part two of the two-part lecture. Now, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who of course assumed the presidency upon the assassination of President Kennedy, had a long experience in the Senate. He had been elected as one of the senators from Texas in 1948, and in 1955, he had become the Senate Majority Leader when the Democrats assumed a majority in the Senate. In stark contrast to Kennedy, Johnson really knew how to make deals on legislation. He would often have drinks late in the evening with other senators or members of the House of Representatives. And one of his famous quotes was, it is the politician's task to pass legislation, not sit around saying principled things. So he was a real mover and shaker. And as president, he used those great abilities to pass significant legislation that we'll see in a minute. The first major piece of legislation was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This had long been blocked by Democrats from the South. And you'll recall the South had been solidly Democratic and had been led by segregationist, racist Democrats. And obviously, they were going to oppose the Civil Rights Act. The passage of the Civil Rights Act, which was largely due to Democrats outside of the South, and most Republicans supported it, that passage led to many of these Southern Democrats moving to the Republican Party. But it's important to note that the Republican Party had in general supported the Civil Rights Act. So this was more just an act of frustration by the Southern Democrats. Early in his presidency, Johnson launched what he called his War on Poverty and a number of federal programs to attack poverty. And the real driver for this among much of the public was Michael Harrington's famous book, The Other America, in which he essentially said, there is another America there that we don't really see, because here we are in the 1960s, people are dressing much more informally than in previous times, so we don't really know who's poor or middle class. You can't just judge them at the gas station filling their tank or whatever. And this led to significantly greater federal government power through these programs. Now, in the 1964 election, Lyndon Johnson ran for election, and his Republican opponent was Barry Goldwater, who is on the extreme right wing of the Republican Party. And in fact, Barry Goldwater was a senator, was one of the very few Republicans in Congress who had voted against the important Civil Rights Act of 1964. Among his rather extreme positions as candidate, he wanted to totally eliminate the income tax. He wanted to significantly cut Social Security, which would have obviously affected millions of Americans. He wanted to end all assistance, financial assistance to college students, and he advocated more massive bombing of North Vietnam, and he even suggested that nuclear weapons be used. Well, largely because of Goldwater's extremism, there was a landslide victory for Lyndon Johnson. In fact, Goldwater only won his home state of Arizona and 5 lower South states. But Goldwater's candidacy did have an impact on the Republican Party and a great legacy. What it did is it caused the South to move more and more to Republicans. Many blacks left the Republican Party. They were just disgusted with Goldwater's views, particularly the fact that he had opposed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But Goldwater, who was as a senator, could speak well in public, his ideas, not all of his positions, but his general philosophy of reducing the size and scope of the government, inspired many young conservatives, including Ronald Reagan, who, of course, went on to serve 2 terms as president in the 1980s, and we'll see more about shortly. Now that he had been elected in his own right as president in 1964, Lyndon Johnson moved quickly to expand the Great Society program, as he called it. The Medicare program started at this time, and we still have this, and this is a program largely for the elderly. Everybody who works pays a 1% tax on their earnings that goes to Medicare. For those of you who are working, you can look at your deductions and you'll see a 1% tax on your earnings. This is in addition to Social Security. Social Security is technically known as OSHA, and that you'll see on your earnings statement if you're working or have worked, and that's, I think it's 6.5% now you pay. So Medicare is a very important program. It accounts for about 20 or 25% of total federal government outlays. And you also have Medicaid. Now, the two sound the same, Medicare and Medicaid, particularly since the first 6 letters are the same. But Medicare is not for the elderly. These are federal grants to the states, and it's a joint federal government, state government program to help the poor with medical expenses. And this is still in existence, and it's a major program in the United States. And also, Johnson oversaw a significant increase in federal scholarships for the poor college students. Here we have a photograph of Lyndon Johnson with his wife behind him on the right in the blue dress, signing the Medicare legislation. Lyndon Johnson often went out and met with poor people. Here he is, meeting with some poor farmers. I've forgotten whether this is in Kentucky or Tennessee. In fact, during Lyndon Johnson's presidency, there were an additional 435 so-called Great Society laws that were approved by Congress. The main ones, of course, were Medicare, Medicaid, and you had the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and then the all-important Voting Rights Act of 1965. And the goal was to ensure all citizens could vote. You'll recall when we were talking about Jim Crow laws, and in the South how they had tried to disenfranchise blacks with what they thought were clever schemes to keep the blacks from voting. There was no state constitution, no prohibition on blacks voting, but they effectively kept them from voting, as we saw by requiring literacy tests, poll taxes, and other such things. So what the Voting Rights Act did, it allowed the federal government to intervene and move into areas where there appeared to be racial discrimination in voting turnout. And it was very, very important and effective legislation. However, Lyndon Johnson was very, very frustrated in general. His grandiose plans for the Great Society, which was his major concern, it was limited. A lot of the programs were passed by Congress, couldn't really become functional because of the huge increase in Vietnam War spending at this time. We've already looked at Vietnam, and we'll see a little more about Vietnam subsequently. You'll recall that both as president and then as senator and then as president, Kennedy had believed in the domino theory. He felt very strongly that if the United States did not prevent South Vietnam from becoming communist, then the neighboring countries of Laos and Cambodia would become communist, then Thailand, then India, then Philippines, on and on and on. And we looked at that a little earlier in the course. Now, North Vietnam was supporting the communist guerrillas in South Vietnam, and those were called the Viet Cong, or VC. And their goal was to unify the country under communism. Now, there was a gradual escalation in U.S. Military involvement. It didn't happen overnight or even in 1 year. But by 1969, there were over 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. That's 542,000. That's a huge number of troops in such a relatively small country. So here you can see, we've seen this map before, North Vietnam in sort of brownish, South Vietnam in the dark green. And one frustration for the United States, which was supporting the South Vietnamese government, were the North Vietnamese were sending troops and supplies down through Laos and then to some extent through Cambodia and what became known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Now, Congress never formally declared war on Vietnam. She declared war to fight North Vietnam. But what happened was Congress did pass the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. The Gulf of Tonkin is an area off of Vietnam where the United States maintained that a U.S. Navy vessel was attacked by torpedoes shot from a North Vietnamese ship. There was no damage to the U.S. vessel, and it's been debated to this very day as to whether the event actually took place. But be that as it may, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which was broadly worded and used by Lyndon Johnson to justify increased U.S. military involvement in Vietnam. Johnson started bombing North Vietnam, sending large numbers of heavy bombers over Vietnam to bomb the cities and where they believed bases were in the jungle. But he did have a limited goal. The United States never wanted to fight this as a classic war, but rather the goal was to prevent North Vietnam and the Viet Cong from winning in the South, forcing them to a negotiated settlement. And this is very, very similar to the Korean War, which we've already studied, where North Korea invaded South Korea, you'll recall, and the goal was to push North Korea out of South Korea, which is what happened, of course, and then they went back to the status quo ante, in other words, the status quo before the war started. And that was the goal of the United States. And many military people came out later and subsequently, said, well, how could they fight a war like this with one or almost two hands tied behind their back? But the U.S. military did not have a green light to just invade North Vietnam. Well, a major problem for the U.S. was the troops simply were not trained for the guerrilla warfare in the jungles of Vietnam, but they'd been trained, and all U.S. military doctrine was designed to fight the Soviets in Europe with tanks and artillery. Well, obviously, tanks are pretty useless in a jungle environment, so they were not properly trained. Also, it was very, very difficult to actually see the enemy because the enemy in the South, the Viet Cong, were peasants, and they'd bury under their little houses because many were very poor, their weapons, and then come out in the evening and fight. So it was really very, very difficult to locate the enemy. And so it was not like World War II, where you had clearly identified armies and you had a front and you could see which way the battles were going. And this caused great confusion among the American public because you would see daily on the news, a battle somewhere in Vietnam. Most Americans had no clue where it was, and it was very difficult to understand how it fit into the grand scheme of things. Another reason Johnson wanted to limit military efforts, he did not want either China or the Soviets to intervene with military forces. And he remembered well what had happened in the Korean War when China had sent in over a third of a million of Chinese soldiers. So a military victory in the classic sense was never possible, and it was never the goal. It was not analogous to World War II, where the goal was unconditional surrender of both Germany and Japan. In the case of Germany, that required huge intervention by the Soviet Union, the United States, and allies to move forces in the ground and actually take over the German capital of Berlin. This was never the goal of Vietnam. The goal was not to move in and take over North Korea and the capital. However, as the war continued and it seemed like it was never going to end, most people didn't really understand what was going on, and U.S. casualties started to increase. Well, there was growing opposition at home. By home, I mean the United States, especially over the draft. The draft is the selective service system, which is still in effect. I still believe that males in the U.S., when they turn 18, must register for the draft, and that's normally done at the time of getting the first driver's license, or when in the driver's license process, and it's called the selective service system. The draft has not been used since the Vietnam War, but the way it worked was they needed soldiers, and so they didn't have enough volunteers. And of course, now we have an all-volunteer military, but they didn't have enough, particularly to serve in the fighting, and so people were called up and required to join the military. We'll have a little more of that in a minute. It was also referred to as the living room war because it was on the TV news every night. Now remember, at this time, there weren't hundreds of TV channels like now. There certainly was no internet. And there were three main television channels, CBS, ABC, and NBC. And they were all three pretty much middle of the road politically, neither extremely conservative nor extremely liberal. Now, the whole situation with news programs has changed in recent years. So people would turn on the news program of their choice, and it was called the living room war because they had reporters actually out with the troops, and thanks to the modern technology of the 1960s, they could beam back live broadcasts via satellite. And so you had newspaper or television reporters actually on a helicopter jumping out the door with the Marines or the Army forces, and you could hear the gunfire. You could even see people being shot and killed, which was, this was not fiction, this was real life. And I mentioned the bombing that was done, and it's an amazing statistic. In 3 years, 1965 to 68, the U.S. dropped more bombs than it had in all of World War II, both in the European theater and the Asian theater. The Americans sort of really, I think it's fair to say, weren't quite sure what was happening. There was no front line like in the World War II. You could pick up a newspaper and see the front line in Europe, particularly after the invasion of D-Day in Normandy. You could see the troops moving slowly. Or in Asia, you could see where the Japanese were and where the Allies were. But the government was very positive, telling people that things were going well. And then there was a major surprise. In January of 1968, the Viet Cong, the communists in the South, led what was called the Tet Offensive. Tet because it was a holiday in Vietnam. And this was a major communist attack throughout South Vietnam in many, many cities at once. And this really surprised Americans who thought the U.S. was winning the war. And all of a sudden, they turn on the TV, and there are many, many attacks. You see the U.S. embassy being shot at in Saigon in South Vietnam. You see many, many casualties among the South Vietnamese government soldiers and more casualties among the Americans. This is one of the early television reporters literally out in the field with the fighting forces. Now, this is the cover of Life magazine, and you can see it says the war goes on. 2 wounded soldiers waiting for a helicopter to evacuate them, and the message was Americans are dying, being wounded, and the war is just dragging on and on. Now, as I mentioned before, Lyndon Johnson was very, very frustrated that the war was greatly undermining the Great Society, and he became very depressed over this. And we'll see in subsequent lectures what actually happened in Vietnam. So in 1968, Lyndon Johnson was not the Democratic candidate. They chose Lyndon Johnson's vice president, Hubert Humphrey, who was from the state of Minnesota. There were massive anti-war demonstrations outside the Democratic Convention, which was held in Chicago, Illinois. And the police used very rough tactics, or what most Americans thought were very rough tactics. I mean, the anti-war demonstrators were throwing bricks, and they weren't, but the public reaction was that this was, the police were too tough, and this hurt Humphrey. Also, Humphrey was campaigning on continuation of Lyndon Johnson's policies, and by this time, people in America many people were tired of Vietnam, the cost, the mounting casualties every day. 5 or 10 people seemed to be killed. Excuse me. And then the Republicans chose as their candidate Richard Nixon. And you'll recall Richard Nixon had, of course, been vice president under Dwight Eisenhower, and he'd been the Republican candidate in the 1960 presidential election and had lost to John Kennedy. Well, Nixon had what turned out to be a very effective message. He and his campaign staff understood the mood of the Americans. They knew the Americans wanted peace in Vietnam, wanted to get out with honor, and many Americans were becoming tired of all the anti-war demonstrations. So Nixon appealed to what he called the silent majority. So he'd often say, I'm speaking to the silent majority of Americans. Yes, that's you sitting in your living room, paying your taxes, obeying the law, and you're not going out and burning flags, American flags, to protest Vietnam. And on Vietnam, he said he wanted peace, but with honor for the country. So he wanted to find an exit strategy to get out of Vietnam, but maintain U.S. honor. And then there was a third party which received many votes, in fact, 10 million votes in the election. And this was called the American Independent Party. Not very often, but about every 20 years or so, there is a third party that receives a significant number of votes. And in this case, party was led by George Wallace, who was well known as a former governor of Alabama who favored racial segregation in the stores, all public buildings, and especially in schools. And there are many famous videos of George Wallace standing in doors of schools, blocking the entry of little black children. So you had 3 parties, and when there's a third party, it often affects the results. So here are the election results in 1968. Well, we see Richard Nixon won the most electoral votes. He won the requisite number, a Republican, and he won all the sort of brownish states there. But close behind in terms of popular vote was Hubert Humphrey, the Democrat. And you see he won Texas, his home state of Minnesota, and some big states like Pennsylvania and New York. So he was close behind in the popular vote, with only 500,000 votes less. But of course, in our system, as we know, it's the electoral vote that counts. But look at the results for George Wallace, the American Independent Party. He received 10 million votes. That's an incredible amount of votes for a third party candidate. And you can see he only won 5 states, all of them so-called deep South states: Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. And that, of course, reflects the vote of people there who favored racial segregation. Well, we'll continue our discussions and continuing also the Vietnam War in the next lecture. Thank you.